Emily was a freshman at the university, excited to experience dorm life for the first time. Her dormitory was old, with long, creaky hallways and rooms that seemed to hum with history. The room she was assigned had been empty for 2 years. No one wanted to live there. The rumors had circulated among the upperclassmen. A girl had disappeared from that very room. She left one night and was never seen again. Emily, skeptical of such stories, shrugged it off. After all, there was no solid evidence of anything paranormal. She moved in, and things were normal at first. That is, until she noticed the closet door. The closet door in her room would never stay shut. No matter how many times she latched it, the door would creak open on its own. It became routine for her to push it closed every night, only for it to be ajar again in the morning. One night, tired from her studies, she decided to ignore the door. She turned off the lights, got into bed, and pulled the covers up to her chin. She was almost asleep when she heard a soft creaking sound. She turned over to face the closet. The door was slowly opening by itself. Emily's heart raced. She sat up, grabbed her phone, and used its flashlight to look into the closet. Empty. But something was off. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. Her breath became shallow, and a sense of dread washed over her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the room. Emily screamed, jumped out of bed, and ran out into the hallway. She refused to go back into that room until her roommate returned the next day. When she told her roommate, Sarah, about the incident, Sarah laughed it off, thinking it was just a draft or a mechanical issue with the door. To ease Emily's mind, they both checked the closet, shining a light into every corner. That's when they saw it. Carved into the back wall of the closet were 3 deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way out. Sarah froze. "I've lived here for 2 years," she whispered. "Those weren't there before." That night, neither of them slept. The closet stayed shut, but they both felt it, a cold presence lingering, watching. Emily moved out the following week. No one ever stayed in that room for long. Story 2. The midnight study group Mark, Lily, and Jason were seniors, cramming for their finals late into the night in the university library. The building had an eerie feel after midnight, with only the dim overhead lights and the hum of fluorescent bulbs keeping them company. The 3 friends chose the basement for their study group, a place students rarely ventured because it was always too quiet, too cold. Around 2 a.m., after hours of silence, Lily heard something strange. It was faint at first, a soft whispering, like the murmur of distant voices. She looked up from her book, glancing around the basement, but Mark and Jason seemed unfazed. She tried to brush it off, thinking her exhaustion was playing tricks on her. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language she had ever heard. She nudged Jason, asking if he heard it too. He paused, listening. "No, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice uneasy. Mark noticed their exchange and removed his headphones. "What's going on?" "I keep hearing these whispers," Lily replied, her voice trembling slightly, like voices from behind the shelves. Jason rolled his eyes. "It's just your mind messing with you. We're all tired." But then they all heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, coming from the dark corner of the basement where the stacks of old, unused books were stored. Jason stood up, determined to prove it was nothing. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing his phone for light. Lily and Mark watched him walk into the darkness. The air seemed to thicken around them as Jason disappeared behind the rows of shelves. They heard him muttering to himself, and then silence. Minutes passed, and he didn't return. Lily was about to call out for him when a loud crash echoed through the basement. She and Mark jumped to their feet, running toward the noise. They found Jason lying on the floor, his phone smashed next to him. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Mark asked, shaking him. Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something in the stacks. I saw it. A figure. It wasn't human." They didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing their things, they rushed out of the library, not daring to look back. The next morning, the library staff found the shelves in disarray, books scattered everywhere. No one could explain it. None of them ever returned to the basement, and no one else who studied there after midnight ever reported anything because no one dared to. Story 3, the roommate who never left Sophie had always been a night owl, staying up late to work on her thesis. She lived off campus in a small rundown apartment complex near the university. Her roommate, Clara, was more introverted, keeping mostly to herself, and they rarely crossed paths during the day. But at night, Sophie would hear Clara moving around, pacing the apartment, sometimes muttering softly. One night, as Sophie was typing away, she heard Clara talking in her room. It wasn't unusual. Clara often spoke on the phone late at night. But this time, something was different. The tone was low, almost like Clara was arguing with someone. Curious, Sophie knocked on Clara's door. The talking stopped abruptly. "Clara? Everything okay?" Sophie called out. No response. Sophie knocked again, but still nothing. She shrugged it off and went back to her work, assuming Clara had gone to bed. The next morning, Sophie found a note on the kitchen table. It was from Clara, saying she had gone home for the weekend and wouldn't be back until Monday. Sophie froze. If Clara had left the night before, who had been in her room? Her mind raced. Was someone in the apartment with her? She ran to the front door, checking the locks. Everything was secure. But that night, the strange noises continued. Footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking, and the soft murmur of Clara's voice. By Sunday night, Sophie was on edge. She texted Clara, asking if she had come back early. Clara responded quickly, saying she was still at her parents' house and wouldn't be back until Monday morning. Sophie barely slept. The apartment felt wrong. The air was thick, like someone was watching her. She stayed in her room, the door locked, waiting for morning. When Clara finally returned, Sophie was visibly shaken. She told Clara about the noises and the voice. Clara listened quietly, her face pale. "I never told you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "The last girl who lived here before me, she died in this apartment. In my room. They say she never left." Sophie moved out a week later, but the apartment stayed empty after that. No one wanted to live in a place where something, or someone, still lingered, watching, waiting. These three terrifying tales are a reminder that some student experiences go beyond the stress of exams and papers. Sometimes, the real horror is what lurks just beyond the edge of reason, waiting to be discovered in the shadows of campus life. Here's a continuation with one more story to add more depth and keep the eerie atmosphere alive. Story 4. The Eyes in the Auditorium. Jessica was a drama student at a prestigious art school, known for its old buildings and long-standing theatrical history. The school's main auditorium was a massive, dimly lit space, with towering curtains and seats that could easily fit an audience of hundreds. It was the pride of the campus, but it also had a sinister reputation. Students whispered about odd happenings during rehearsals, props that moved on their own, voices from the wings, and shadows that darted between rows of empty seats. Jessica, always rational, scoffed at the rumors. She had a lead role in the fall production and spent many late nights rehearsing by herself after everyone had gone home. One evening, after a particularly exhausting practice, she decided to run through one last scene alone on stage. As she moved through her lines, she noticed something strange. A cold breeze swept across the stage, causing the heavy red curtains to sway slightly. She ignored it, attributing it to the old ventilation system. But then, something more unnerving happened. She could feel it, a pair of eyes watching her from the darkness. The auditorium was completely empty. She had locked the doors herself. But as she spoke her lines, her voice echoing through the large space, she felt the weight of someone or something glaring at her. She stopped mid-sentence, peering out into the dark rows of seats. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. Silence. She swallowed hard and tried to continue. But the sensation didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger, as if the unseen eyes were drawing closer, fixating on her. Then she saw it, two faint glowing dots in the back row. They blinked, almost like human eyes, but they weren't. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze on the stage, unable to tear her gaze from the glowing eyes, which now seemed to be slowly rising from the seat. A figure, tall, gaunt, and barely visible in the shadows, was standing at the far end of the auditorium. It didn't move, but Jessica could feel its presence, its overwhelming hostility. She ran, Without even grabbing her belongings, she sprinted off the stage and into the wings, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. When she gathered the courage to return the next day, the auditorium was empty, just as she had left it. But the janitor, an old man who had worked at the school for decades, noticed her pale face and shaking hands. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Jessica blinked, her heart still racing. "Saw who?" The janitor sighed and shook his head. "They say he was a student here years ago. Died during a production, right on that stage. And he's been here ever since, watching, waiting for someone to take his place." Jessica didn't return to the auditorium alone after that. No one did. These additional stories only further highlight the eerie and unsettling experiences students can encounter in seemingly normal school environments. From dorm rooms and libraries to off-campus apartments and even auditoriums, the unknown often lingers just out of sight, waiting for the curious, the skeptical, or the unlucky. Let's keep the eerie momentum going and add more spine-chilling tales. Story 5. The silent student in the lab. Tom was a third-year biology major, spending most of his time in the lab, especially late at night when it was quieter, and he could work without distractions. The science building was one of the oldest on campus, known for its drafty halls and dim lighting. Rumor had it that a student had died in one of the labs years ago, during an experiment gone wrong. But Tom didn't pay much attention to campus ghost stories. One evening, well past midnight, Tom was working on an experiment in the far corner of the lab. The only light came from his workstation and the faint glow of emergency exit signs at the end of the room. As he focused on his petri dish, he heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hallway. He looked up, expecting to see one of his classmates or maybe a late-night janitor, but no one appeared. The footsteps continued, soft but deliberate, as if someone was pacing just outside the lab. Tom felt the hairs on his arms stand up. He called out, "Hello?" His voice echoed in the empty hallway. No answer. Trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, he returned to his work. A few minutes later, he heard the footsteps again, this time closer. Tom's heart raced. He stood up, walked over to the door, and peered out into the hallway. It was completely empty. Feeling unsettled, he went back to his workstation and decided to finish quickly. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow, almost like someone standing near the sink across the room. He turned his head slowly. There, standing by the sink, was the silhouette of a student. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, motionless, staring at him. Tom's throat went dry. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when he opened his eyes, the shadow was still there. "Hey!" Tom called out, his voice trembling. No response. He backed away slowly, grabbing his bag and bolted for the door. As he ran down the hallway, the footsteps began again. Only this time, they were behind him, fast and relentless, chasing him out of the building. Tom didn't stop running until he was outside, gasping for air, the cool night breeze doing nothing to calm his racing heart. The next day, he told his professor what had happened. The professor, an older man with years of experience in the department, gave Tom a solemn look. "You're not the first one to see him," the professor said quietly. "That student who died, he was working in that same lab, and some say he never left." Tom never stayed late in the lab again. Story 6. The haunted fraternity house. Brian had just pledged to a fraternity known for its wild parties. But what most people didn't know was that the house had a darker reputation. Decades ago, before the fraternity moved in, the house had been a boarding school, and one of the students had mysteriously died in one of the upstairs rooms. The fraternity brothers liked to tell new pledges this story to scare them, but Brian wasn't easily spooked. As part of his initiation, Brian had to spend the night alone in the attic, an old dusty room filled with forgotten furniture and relics of the past. The house creaked constantly, and the attic was especially bad, with its slanted ceiling and drafty windows. But Brian wasn't worried. He settled into a chair with a flashlight and a book, determined to make it through the night without being frightened by old ghost stories. An hour passed, and everything was quiet. The wind howled outside, and the occasional creak of the house settled in. But then Brian heard something strange. a faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the attic. He turned his flashlight toward the noise, expecting to see a rat or some other pest. Instead, he saw the dusty rocking chair in the corner, moving on its own. It creaked back and forth slowly, as if someone unseen was sitting in it. Brian's heart pounded. He got up, shining his light on the chair, hoping it was just the wind. But the chair kept moving, and the scratching sound grew louder, this time coming from the walls. It was as if something was inside, desperately trying to get out. He backed away, his hands shaking, when suddenly the temperature in the attic dropped. He could see his breath in the air. Then, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw something that made him freeze, a handprint on the attic window. But not just any handprint, it was on the inside of the glass. Before Brian could react, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking him inside. The scratching intensified, now coming from all sides, as if the very walls were alive. He grabbed his phone to call for help, but it slipped from his sweaty hands, clattering to the floor. Just as he was about to panic, the door burst open, and the fraternity president stood there, wide-eyed. "Get out of there!" he shouted. Brian didn't need to be told twice. He ran out of the attic and down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the bottom, the president looked at him grimly. "That room," the president said quietly, "was where the student died. We don't tell the pledges, but sometimes things happen up there. You're not the first to see it." Brian moved out of the fraternity house the following semester. No one ever stayed in the attic overnight again. Story 7. The vanishing classmate Melissa was a sophomore taking a difficult chemistry class that required a lot of group work. One day, she was assigned to work with a girl named Anna, someone she had seen in class but had never spoken to. Anna was quiet, a bit withdrawn, but seemed smart and diligent. They spent several hours working together in the library, and Melissa found Anna to be friendly enough. Although she seemed to avoid eye contact and spoke in a hushed tone. The odd thing was, when they finished working, Anna said, "Thanks for helping me today. I don't usually have a partner." The next day in class, Melissa went to sit next to Anna. But when she approached her usual seat, it was empty. Melissa assumed Anna was late, but when she asked the professor, he looked confused. "Anna? There's no one by that name in this class," he said. Melissa was taken aback. "What do you mean? We were working together in the library yesterday." The professor's face grew serious. "That can't be possible," he said. "Anna was a student in this class last year, but she died in a car accident." Melissa felt a cold chill run down her spine. She checked the group assignment sheet again. Anna's name wasn't on it. It was as if she had never existed. Yet Melissa distinctly remembered her, remembered their conversation, her quiet demeanor, her pale skin. The memory of their study session haunted Melissa. Sometimes when she was in the library, she thought she saw Anna's figure at a distance, sitting alone at a table, her back to her. But when Melissa got closer, the figure would vanish, leaving an empty seat behind. These creepy tales dive deep into the strange and unexplainable experiences that some students face, reminding us that sometimes the real world can be just as terrifying as the supernatural. From haunted attics to vanishing classmates, the unknown seems to lurk around every corner, waiting for its next victim.